panel right here, we're going to be talking about expanding a bit deeper into build creations, and we have some prominent streamers and content creators with us, including myself, who's been in the game for a few years now and making build guides. So we're going to talk about that more in depth, basically. Though we do want to shout out that we most likely know less about 3.9 and 4.0 compared to you guys at home who've been watching all the panels. So we don't really actually have any deeper or extra information about the mechanics in the upcoming expansion for 3.9 and 4.0. So we're going to talk about these things, and we're going to dive into basically how we start off our mindset when approaching a build, and what we focus on in designing this. So with us we have myself, Ghazzy TV, and Raiz sitting here right next to me, Engineering Eternity, and Mathil. So Raiz, maybe you can start off this with going into how you approach a build when you go into a new league with the information that we have, even though it's pretty scarce.
Yeah, usually the way I'm going to build my builds is I mostly play solo self-found, by the way. A lot of hardcore as well. But still, I like to play kind of niche skills, not as meta. So pick a skill that I really like, maybe sometimes 2 skills, something for single target, something for AoE, and I'll try and build kind of from the back. A lot of people build damage initially. I try and build defense as much as possible because, well, I'm not that capable of a player sometimes, so I need that extra little bit of a buffer. And so I'll usually layer maybe 2 or 3 types of defense, maybe some leech, maybe some regeneration. I'm a big fan of energy shield and kind of mixing energy shield with HP, especially recently with hybrid. I hope that's going to stay very nice in the upcoming 3.9 and 4.0.
All right. So like when it comes to the situation with designing a defensive aspect, there's a lot of layers one can talk about. For example, that we could briefly touch upon is like a defensive layer could be in the form of you actually shattering or freezing an entire room as you go in, which is in general an offensive aspect, but it becomes a defensive layer. And these things kind of dictates how much of your EHP pool you actually want to focus on. How is this affecting, like, because from our group that we're here with, I've been racing a little bit. You've been more focused on racing. I know Mathil's been racing before with the Ice Nova character.
Yeah, I have to let everyone know every single time that I am proficient enough in hardcore and solo self-found to get at least top 3 in a race. So people doubt my hardcore ability all the time, but trust me, it's there.
Exactly. So like with those things in mind, and coming from a person that races every league pretty much, so with these aspects in mind, how do you design the approach for your sake when it comes to racing? Because that's very different from the point of view that I have when I make guides, for example.
I think it's a better question for these guys, simply because what you mentioned previously about shattering, for instance, being a source of defense, I kind of lack in that department, I'll be honest. Usually I'll build the hard layer and I kind of worry about the rest later, which is why usually the characters that I build don't really delve very far because the Widows give me.
Well, it is actually a bit of an interesting question because for the racing perspective, you say you like to build more into defense to start with when racing's all about going really fast and taking risky plays. So do you build more into offense to start with on that and just hope that you hold up with your skill and everything there, or do you still take the defensive approach and then somehow up the speed?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I haven't finished a race in 3 years, yeah.
So taking the right approach, which is the softcore approach, because you say you start defensive. I start the polar opposite. I will start with as much damage as I can possibly get on a build, and then from there I'll start to make defensive improvements as I feel the build needs it, because I want it to have the viability of killing everything and feeling good to begin with. And then you try and fix up the defense afterwards, because yeah, in the hardcore sense, you just start with the defense and then go the other route.
I mean, especially in softcore, when you're going for that first league push, you're really looking to get there as fast as you can. And even if you incur a death or 2, it's not a complete setback like in hardcore. So you do go that first routing, and especially when you're considering making your first build, you do have to consider maybe taking the pathing for the final build tree isn't the best option. And I have to kind of show some of the people that I play with, and when I'm going through my own builds, is taking special pathing for maybe more damage, not getting all the life nodes first. But then once you hit that point where you're maybe in maps, you swap back your tree, you put into life nodes, you take out of damage nodes as you increase your gear and your power through different variations. So yeah, in terms of between the soft core and the hardcore, there's so many different ways you can go about making builds, and you can even take the pure blast cannon option into hardcore, and some people do that. But it's all about the player and what their goals are and where they want to go with their builds, and that's a big part of builds. The origin of what you or why you would even make a build is why you want to play and how you want to play.
I think that's something that needs to be touched upon as well. Like, we're in a situation where some content creators focuses on actually making guides, whereas the approach of making a guide is very different from making a build that you yourself want to play. Because you can make a build for yourself that costs 500 exalteds, and then you do what you do to get there. And then you have the other approach that if you make a guide, you have to make sure that guide caters to a specific type of player. Is it going to be for someone who is not going to make 100 exalted within the first week, or is it someone basically a build that you wanted to play and just made a guide for this is how I did, and it costs this much, and it doesn't really care about the budget. For the approach that I do, I focus a lot on beginner-friendly builds that are able to be played on a lower budget. So what I do is I pretty much smack up the absolute best stuff I can do through third-party tools like POB. Create the build, and then I pretty much slaughter it down to the point where, okay, this is a beginner-friendly budget state, and it's nowhere near what I first started with. And then at that point, I'll try it and tweak it to a point where I think it's that I'm happy with it. But I kind of approach it where my damage that I'm going for the most part has like a goal. If I want to do Uber Elder, I want to make sure that the damage is enough to be able to handle that, and everything else goes into defense. So that's basically where I'm designing the situation for my personal build approaches with a goal in mind. So if I want to do clear speed, then that's the focus. If it is a boss kill, then that boss approach is the main focus of the build. So I don't want to get more damage than I need, and then everything else can be put into the defensive aspect to allow the player to make as many mistakes as possible while still actually completing the goal the build was designed for.
Yeah, that's a big thing, like knowing your goals and how to approach them. And no matter what, people are going to come to you, or you're going to be looking for builds that are the cheapest to make, that do the most things possible. And that's not always possible, but there are a lot of options and ways you can meld between different builds that end up giving you that growth from maybe a league starter into a lab farmer, then you move them into maps or doing endgame content with minor tweaks. And that's really the kind of builds that I look for, just as my own interest in the game, because I like to do all the content and I like to experience it, but I don't like to break the bank, so to speak, that I have to spend months or weeks, trying to accumulate the gear and the currency just to get to that point. Because I like to cycle through builds, much like Mathil. Every week he's on a new build, and I'm very much the same in that regard.
Yeah, so. And same sort of approach here, where I will absolutely try and cater a build to just being able to do everything. For me, a build, I think definition of success is your own, it's your own definition of success for a build. Do you want it to just be able to do really deep delving? Do you want it to just have boss killing ability? My definition of success is being able to do everything and do it in a fun enough sense. So I'm always building to kill the Uber Elder, to do some decent delving, to do some good clear speed, and have somewhat of an okay budget. So it's really, tailored to whoever's making their own build, and I try and just share that philosophy with everyone. And it seems to get people interested as well, because they also just, for the most part, want to clear the entire game. And if you want, you can then tailor the build yourself to a more specific niche.
I like that approach when it comes to specifically for guide making, right? Not bottlenecking and forcing the reader or follower or whatever is following the guide to basically feel that you just got to do this. There's no other options. So basically have an open template. This is the idea that I went for, but you can do so much more with this. There's so many tweaks. If you want to put more or less currency into it, you want to do a niche style with it, there's so many options. And I think that's a really good way to do it. That's
a huge part of Path of Exile at its core, is how many options you have. And I try to make it somewhat apparent in the guides that I make, that this is what I chose to do, but there are so many other options. And it's really about exploring what works for you, maybe what you have the budget for, or what actually makes the build more fun for you. Because it's a game. It's about having fun.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, I very often just leave builds, let's say 80% done, so that if you really want, you can spend dozens of exalts absolutely min-maxing and fine-tuning it and take it that little bit further. But in the current state of the game, it's really not necessary. And it's just, you can take it to halfway and it'll be fine. You can take it a little bit further and it'll be really good. If you take it all the way and spend a lot of currency, it'll be just so much overkill that, well, typically you can play it to level 100 and have enough fun, because if you're going to do that, you probably want to invest a bit more all the way in.
Oh, absolutely. So we talked a bit about like our focus on how we approach a league starter, right? So if we take a look at 3.9, we have very little information. Like we mentioned before, we have less information than most of you guys at home, most likely. So with that in mind, the things we know with Metamorphosis that we've seen was kind of heavily showing off these boss abilities, basically, from these monsters. So with that information in mind, how would you guys feel about approaching your next build without having the patch notes? It's a really tough question, and I hate answering it myself, but I figured we could talk about it.
Don't play hardcore. Just don't.
Yeah. I do feel as though this type of, release and stuff like that is just so much less hardcore friendly these days, because you just never know what's coming. And in softcore, you actually get to play around with these mechanics and avoid them, learn from them. Whereas in hardcore, you get one shot, and when you don't know what the boss is going to throw at you, you just have no idea how to approach it. And I just think, PoE is becoming less hardcore friendly in that viability. And if things get tankier and harder and they're going to require more damage, it's going to be harder to build those hardcore builds and still clear everything in the game without being too slow.
Something cool, though, in Metamorphosis is that you have a select, to my understanding anyway. The bosses have different types of attacks, so you're going to have like a big cooldown, like a big AoE skill, that sort of thing, and you can kind of build it around your character, which is something that we've never really had before. So maybe there's a particular boss that you really like that drops a particular set of moves that you're looking for.
They've said that they're kind of marketing it as build your own boss encounter, and tailoring it those boss encounters, not only their skills, what they deal, its damage, but what they give as rewards. So they're kind of packing in what they had from Legion and all those chests, like those categorized rewards into these bosses. But I guess coming back to the builds, before we go too far into the league, is like we're looking at fighting particular bosses or bosses we're choosing. So that leads to, you could specialize if you know what kind of bosses you're looking at, or you can really look at it as just more like common boss encounters and look at it from the perspective of just general viability of your build. If you're already looking at pushing maps and high-end content, I'm almost positive you're going to be able to be doing a lot of this league content as it is. And if you know a lot of the, it's going to take research to understand which ones are the ones you're going to go after. But once you start to know those bosses and you understand which ones you're going to be fighting, you're going to know what skills are going to work out the best with them and how to build around them. And then, of course, everybody's going to flock to that. But yeah, for me, going into a league like this, I basically look at it as, don't focus too much on the league mechanic, but focus on something that you know is reliable and something that you know is pretty proven. Because I've been burned many a times going into new skills or just new builds that I've never tried before and really struggling to get myself through just the story as it is. So I like to look at it from a general.
So with the tried and tested builds, you're going to start with Tornado Shot in 3.9 and just see how it goes?
Exactly.
It's not a league starter, come on.
But yeah, that's what I try and tell like my close friends or anybody that asks me about going for builds is like, take a look at what worked in previous leagues. And especially if you cross-reference patch notes, you're going to have the same success. Like just because one build got buffed in this league doesn't mean the other build is no longer any good. Like there's many builds like ED Contagion that have been very stock standard for many leagues and work just fine. And you don't have to be completely inventive just to be successful. But of course, everybody has their own desires and wants for their builds.
Yeah, absolutely. With the starter builds, oftentimes I could reuse the same starter build video like 6 leagues in a row.
Oh, exactly.
And that part of the challenge is then coming up with new and interesting stuff that's still going to be kind of cheap, but a lot of the times you still want to recommend the same thing. And especially because you use it yourself and then think, yeah, that was a great starter. Why wouldn't I just reuse that one? But you want to give more new options. And it does become a bit of a challenge finding new starter builds when only certain things are just going to be the most efficient and effective starters. But on that same note as well, they sometimes will just nerf something that's way too meta. And I think something that a lot of people fall into as a bit of a trap is they just completely disregard it. They say, well, Cyclone got nerfed by 5%, done, not playing that ever again, when it's still probably going to be one of the best starters out there, one of the best builds, but just the word nerf or any sort of toning down takes people completely away from it for whatever reason. And then at some point throughout the league, I'll jump into the nerfed skills and go, hey guys, this is still really good. And they go, oh, didn't know that for some reason.
I understood that a lot of people deny themselves fun in that way because a lot of the times, even though maybe that skill directly is going to be nerfed, the amount of other stuff they're releasing, like an item that could benefit that, if they just enjoy the skill, they could potentially have just a stronger build next league, even though the skill technically has been nerfed.
Yeah, like I find it very interesting with, for example, one of the more pressing metas we've had in the past has been Cyclone, and we had Winter Orb, for example, and we already know that both of these abilities are still today really strong. Almost nobody plays them. But then again, GGG are also have stated that they like this meta shift. So they're doing this and enforcing them. So we are most likely going to assume that we're going to see Summoner being nerfed for the 3.9. That doesn't mean the Summoners might be, you know, completely unplayable. So I mean, with that in mind as well, I think that if we're talking about the 3.9 approach of how to approach a build with the information that we have right now, being, from what we've seen, seem to be a bit more focused around bossing. The way I feel about it is that I would rather than just look at it as an Uber Elder fight, how much damage you need for Uber Elder, and then basically make sure that everything I do is for that approach, and then stack up as much defense as possible. So whatever that boss will shoot at me, I will have as much layers of defense or enough EHP to make a lot of mistakes.
Oh man,
so I like that.
I haven't played the demo yet. Yeah. But from what I'm hearing, it's like literally the first boss keeps killing people over and over, and like I don't know if you could build enough defense.
Let me tell you this. You said don't play hardcore. For the demo, don't play Summoner.
Yeah?
They ramped up the difficulty. Those, yeah, no.
Nice. Well, Summoners might potentially get nerfed, but they also might get a new boost with the new announcements with the sockets, where you can socket multiple gems into each other. Effectively, to my understanding, you have 8 6-links, and that's definitely something a Summoner could benefit from. So if you're a Summoner fan and you see some nasty stuff in the patch notes, I think the new gem system is coming out with 3.9?
New gem system's in 4.0.
Oh, it is
Yeah.
4.0. Oh, okay, never mind that.
Quite a while to go.
Yeah.
We'll get there, though.
Yeah, we'll get there fast, I think.
Oh, absolutely. So with the perspective of going in and seeing that like 3.9 has these boss spawns, and from my personal take with what I was saying, it's currently from the builds that I play would be an Occultist CI Vortex build. I just love it. It plots the damage, and I can run around and dodge everything whilst I still do damage. So that would be how, with the information we have, how I would approach the league in the current state, because I can get that defensive layers. But EE, how about, how would you take it with the information that we have? How would you approach it?
I'd probably approach it like almost every other league where, as I was saying, just reliable starters. You know, just like Mathil, I like to, even for my own self, I like to play something new to me, at least, that brings something a bit more enjoyment to me, because I really like making builds and exploring all the different mechanics within Path of Exile. So I don't like to go too overboard, you know, starting out the league and make something that's too requirements, you know, needs a bunch of uniques or anything like that. But I, of course, have staple builds like the Thick Jug or something along those lines, where I go with the classic tried and true Marauder builds, or even Duelist builds, and I like to go with a lot of defensive layers, even though I'm in softcore, just because I enjoy staying alive. So yeah, I like to go with something along those lines that I know has been tried and true, and it's fun to play with me. I'll just throw some different skills on it and maybe go with a different setup in that regard.
All right.
Yeah. I don't feel like I have a choice. They were talking about Explosive Arrow. I love Ignite. I love Explosive Arrow. I don't see myself playing anything else, honestly, for a league start. And I've talked about Explosive Arrow before, where I kind of gave it a little bit too much credit. And I've been proven wrong. So maybe this time around it's gonna be a little bit better.
Well, has an Explosive Arrow actually been used as a rather common ability to farm Hall of the Grandmaster?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it's been common for a long time now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. It can definitely be one of those skills, especially with the way Ignites work right now and the fact that you can build explosive arrow around crit. That was something that people were doing. You can definitely make a pretty good boss killer. So I don't think it's going to be too bad of a start. But also don't quote me on that. All right.
But I just think, yeah, that's the right approach for one of these big extra content leagues where you don't know what you're going to be facing. You want to take the build that's the most well-rounded, most polished one that you've got, and yeah, one that you think can take on any content, which was, for me, years ago when they first released Exile, which was my elemental buzzsaw, I knew for a fact before I went into that league that I could take on anything that the game was going to throw at me with that build because it had such good, defensive and offensive properties. And there's plenty of builds out there these days that have that sort of real well-roundedness that you should just really try and look into for 3.9. You don't want to try anything too quirky, too crazy, at least if you want to experience all the content anyway.
Whoa. You said it's the right approach, but now you're telling me explosive arrow is not the right approach.
Let's say if we're a veteran player like Raiz, it's the right approach.
We'll see if I make it to maps,
Yeah, you'll be fine, Raiz.
Maybe. Yeah, but that is very interesting because you also like to play kind of. You've proven, I think, to everybody, Mathil, that you can literally play any skill and it'll work in PoE.
Yeah, in the current state of the game anyway, as the difficulty ramps up and there's less power creep and all that, it does get quite a bit more challenging to make some of the more lackluster skills work. But in the current state of the game, it's one of the best states, I think. Yeah, there's a lot of power creep, some things are going to be too strong, but you can also just pick up any skill and make it work and have a lot of fun with it. And even just in your one build that you've already made, you can change up a few little things, play a different skill, and it feels like a completely different thing, and it's still going to be clearing the entire game, and I think it's a really good thing at the moment.
I can agree on that, and I think that's something that we all know exists within the current state. But I also think that it's important to also be wary of the fact that most people are not at the point where they have the understanding of it, which is why it's so good that we have content creators like us making sure that just to hype us up a little bit here, boys. Yeah. So I mean, I think it's important to know that the Path of Exile has a very steep learning curve, and for anyone to just pick up any skill and just go play it, it's not, without the information and knowledge behind the game, that's not going to work entirely. But having the knowledge behind us allows us to do these things, and that's how that's one of the best things about the game, the versatility behind it, and I really appreciate that.
Thing is too that sometimes choosing a build where you have to think about a lot of your decisions, maybe initially if you're a new player, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But if you try and figure out kind of your own style, what you're looking for, you might engage with a little bit more mechanics than the average guy who just goes on the forums, picks a Sunder build and does the same thing every time, right? You might get a better idea, and therefore you can craft a better build for yourself for the future. And PoE is one of those games where you are going to be coming back, well, hopefully, every 3 months. And I think that's important, to build that base of knowledge and slowly get better and better at that.
The whole game is really about knowledge. It's about understanding not only what you want to do in the game, but how the game works. And it's very iterative, the process of making builds and coming up with builds and making successful builds. Like, you can watch any of us make builds, and it doesn't exactly translate just watching us. Like, you have to experience it yourself. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, it's a tough experience going through those steps of figuring out, how much life do I need? How much offense do I need? How much defense do I need? And having someone to help you, either through friends or forums or watching people, it's definitely an investment, but it pays off once you start understanding. It's one of those things for me, like, I was never great at making builds in the beginning. I watched a lot of Mathil, Crip, and everybody like that. And, at a certain point, it kind of clicks just in terms of understanding, oh, it's really just a numbers game. And that's really what it is. It's nothing that ominous or scary.
No, absolutely. I think that our time is about to run up right now, so I want to thank everyone for being here. Make sure you hit that Twitch Prime as well, and check out the next segments.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.